introduces the mediator to the two individuals and gives the ground rules, no yelling, etc. And their mediators go through a training beforehand, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more later on. The officers are not expected to have specific outcomes, but there's an expectation that people will come in with an open mind. In 2005, they only had 6 mediations. And in 2007, they hired a mediation coordinator, and they had 65 mediations. So it just tells you the difference. And now they currently have 61 mediations to about 74 mediations a year. They have to adjudicate cases quickly because the police officer Bill of Rights says complaints need to be investigated in a year. They do not mediate racial slurs, and they don't mediate any cases which involve where there's a civil case that's pending, or a criminal case that's pending, or an issue involving searches. Eligibility issues with the officer come first, so what they do is they determine whether a specific officer or a complaint is eligible before they determine whether the complainant is eligible for to be part of the process. Mediated complaints are still kept on the record for the officer for the purpose of early warning programs, but what they basically say on the disciplinary record is that it was mediated. They don't give the terms of the mediation. They don't say the issues. Officers are allowed to keep their uniform on, and they can also keep their gun, and it's on work time, and if it's not on work time, then they get overtime to come in. And so that's San Francisco, and I just wanted to talk about, San Francisco also does something very interesting in that they do exit surveys, and they give folks exit surveys, and so they have some really interesting data that's come from their program. Some of the data that they got due to their exit surveys during 2010 was the rating of participants' experience with the mediation process. 42% was very satisfied, 43% satisfied, 15% dissatisfied. Whether the mediation location provided a safe environment to freely express concerns and issues, 99% yes, 1% no. Percentage of mediation participants who felt they had the opportunity heard and expressed their thoughts, 99% yes, 1% no. Percentage of participants who felt that other parties fully participated in the mediation process, 87% yes, 13% no. Percentage of participants who felt that the mediators accurately identified and addressed the core issues of the complaint, 94% yes, 6% no. Percentage of participants who felt that the complaint was totally resolved at the mediation, totally resolved was 43%, partially resolved was 36%, not resolved at all was 21%. And just to give you, I think that this is probably the last stat that I got. Rating of participants' experience with the mediation process was 47% very satisfied, 37% satisfied, and 16% dissatisfied. So that was San Francisco, that model. And remember, San Francisco is not compulsory. That's really the big difference between DC and San Francisco. So then what that allows for is that the mediation is totally up to, the officer can refuse to actually mediate a complaint. DC officers don't have the right to refuse the complaint. Once the office makes a determination that the complaint should be mediated, then the officer is obligated to actually go through the process. When the group asked what the numbers look like for DC, if they look like San Francisco, we were told yes, they did, and so we still have to actually get those numbers, but it just tells you that the numbers look somewhat similar. So compulsory means that if the complainant doesn't show up and then it gets dismissed, compulsory means that if the complainant doesn't show up, then the complaint gets dismissed. So it's compulsory for the complainant as well. If the officer doesn't show up, then there's a disciplinary sanction. There is no resolution that will go through the usual process of going through internal affairs. And so the disciplinary sanction is not for the underlying issue, but actually the failure to show up. And when I asked is that a hard and fast rule? I was told that their mediators absolutely bend over backwards to make sure that everybody shows up, and if there's a plausible justification for them not showing up, then there is no disciplinary action. It's just when there's no communication whatsoever. I was told by DC that they have not had an officer who failed to show up this year. That's 2012. They also give exit interviews after the mediation, and they also receive very affirmative support from the program. And what DC basically does is they contact a community mediation program to administer the program. And so that community mediation program is an independent contractor, and they recruit mediators from the mediation program. Their mediation program also works, and before they started to mediate police complaints, they worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office in DC to do work around community issues as well that the U.S. Attorney's Office had felt was an issue. Each mediation costs $800, and they mediate about 8% of the complaints that they receive. They have a staff person who spends, this is the police monitor's office, a staff person who spends about 5% of her time dealing with the mediation program, and they said that they host all the mediations in the police monitor's office, although they're still unsure whether that's the right approach. If resolution is not reached, and then what happens, it goes through the regular process of going through internal affairs. However, everything that happens in the mediation process is confidential. And officers are ineligible if they mediated similar cases in the last 12 months. Where the misconduct is not minor, they won't mediate. And they also gave us some examples of a resolution. So Ursula had handed around some of the agreed upon resolutions. But some of the resolutions that have been mentioned was, for example, a college professor who was a complainant asked that the police officer that he had the complaint against go to his classroom afterwards and actually teach a portion of the class. That was part of the agreement. And another agreement was that the police officer agreed to go to the complainant's church because the complainant really wanted the police officer to realize that he was an esteemed member of his own community and that he was also valued. Officers can be disciplined for not going through with this agreement. I already mentioned that, but that it's usually minor discipline. And they also take on older cases. They don't really have a time period within which they actually have to mediate. So if it's over a year old, the case, they still take it. Their officers are usually paid to show up as well. They're not off duty. They are also allowed to keep their gun, and they also are allowed to keep their uniform. And there's also a sample confidentiality form that I'm going to hand around as well. And I had another meeting with the DC people afterwards, and they had really been trying to push the concept of a required mediation, so that the mediation was not up to the officer. That once the mediation board decides that this is the type of mediation, that the officer is required to do it. And the reason why they were really pushing that model is because they had felt that officers would be reluctant to actually show up to the mediation. Otherwise, once they did show up to the mediation, then they realized that it was not a scary process. It was actually a process that was very supportive of their role. They also told me to get in contact with the JAMS representative, who also, JAMS does mediation, so I'm also doing that. I just recently got an email back from Kansas City. Kansas City also has a mediation program involving police complaint mediation. And I literally just got the email before I left, so I'm just going to go through it very quickly. But every complaint goes to the mediation supervisor's desk, and so that mediation supervisor makes a decision about all of the mediations. First, a letter goes along with an information sheet explaining the process to the complainant. And then that one letter is also followed with an informational sheet briefly describing what mediation is. Their process is also a volunteer process. It's volunteer for the officer or the employee. And as long as the officer or the employee comes to the mediation and a resolution is attempted, then even if the complaint is not satisfied, they will not investigate or handle the complaint in any other fashion. So basically, it's not going to internal affairs after it's been mediated. The process in Kansas City is also confidential. And the very interesting thing that I thought about Kansas City is they have a mediation program, but they also have a conciliation program. And a conciliation program is a little bit like what the police monitor's office sometimes does for complainants. We sometimes sit down with complainants, civilian complainants, with the head of internal affairs or one of the investigators and try to help work through the issues. It's not with the officer themselves. And this conciliation process in Kansas City is similar in that the individual that the director of the mediation program sends the complaint to a division commander that is the division commander for the employee that the complaint is based on. And that complaint will usually filter down to the watch commander, who then filters it to the supervisor sergeant for handling. And that what happens is that then the individual complainant sits down with either the commander or the captain or the division commander and works things out with that division commander. And they have a choice whether they want to do that or not, the complainant. And they're obviously told, the complainant, that that process is not confidential because it's going through the bureau commander. Yeah. So there's also a program in Chicago that I still have to find out a little bit more about. And I want to mention Heather and Allison had mentioned Sam Walker, who had done that mediation piece. He was also at the conference, and so I have a running line of communication if anybody has any questions with that larger piece. I also spoke to an executive director over at Community Mediation Maryland, and that was a very interesting conversation. What they offer is they offer two types of trainings. They offer general mediation training, and then they also offer separate training for mediators who are specifically mediating complaints involving the police department or police officers. And she had advised us as a group that what we should do is that we should try to approach a body of mediators that are already formed so that they already have the necessary experience as mediators, and then afterwards they could, for example, give the training on how to handle police complaint mediations. And they've set up mediation programs for police complaint mediations. Lastly, there's my mediation definition. I knew it was attached somewhere. Lastly, I went and I spoke to civil service because there were some concerns about whether mediation would actually get in the way of the process for civil service. Specifically, after officers go through their initial disciplinary hearing, they're allowed to appeal the decisions up to the Civil Service Commission. And what Civil Service had said is that they are very curious to see what our exclusion-inclusion criteria is going to be and whether that's going to be affecting an appeal. They don't think that it would affect an appeal, but they definitely want to keep up on what's going on. And so I invited them into our group and let them know that they're more than welcome to actually sit in through the process. They also talked about the civil service reform. There's no reform going on with civil service rules. They did not think that it would actually affect appeals as much, so they did not think there was something that we needed to be so concerned about. And then another question they had is if there was fines or suspensions that were involved in the mediation process, that was something that might affect appeals, and so that's something that we have to take into consideration. And lastly, I spoke with Chief Westbrook, and I think that there's some confusion when she had given a presentation here before whether she had wanted a recommendation from this group that PIB would not have to accept certain complaints, but they would automatically become mediated complaints, and she had confirmed with me that that is not the case. She does not want a recommendation from the group. That obviously it's in the interest of PIB, as Allison had mentioned, to mediate many of these complaints because it saves the resources for PIB. Lastly, and maybe more interesting than anything else, is I've started to speak to people about a clause in the federal consent decree. And the reason why I started to speak to people about this clause, and we have a meeting set up with Chief Westbrook as well as with the chief to talk about this specific issue. There is a clause in the consent decree that we think might actually fulfill our resource problem with mediation. You know, we're doing an excellent job of bringing this all together, but obviously this program's not going to go anywhere if we don't have any of the resources to back it. And so it's always been a question for us, as we've been now applying for foundation grants, where should we get this money? And so I just wanted to read the clause that we think relates to the mediation program. And I've spoken to the Department of Justice representatives, and they are supportive of the idea. NOPD and the city agrees to participate in a community-based restorative justice project. NOPD, the city, and DOJ will work to identify an entity to fund and administer this project. The aim of this project shall be to help remedy mistrust between NOPD and the broader New Orleans community and create an environment for successful problem-solving partnerships. Very small, but that's what we're going to be speaking to both the chief and also Chief Westbrook about. That's it.
Yeah. I'll start with Captain Harper, and we'll take questions later.
On the percentage number that you gave, certainly voluntary and mandatory language slightly different, but I think it would be beneficial if we could find the breakdown between the officers and civilians on whatever those categories those questions were. That would also allow us to see if one was dragging the other group down, if there was a difference significant enough. Also, it would allow us to look at and maybe push in a certain direction. If we found one was really more dissatisfied, we could maybe ask them why, if they had any thoughts on why, and maybe we can address that to increase the likelihood of success on our end by dealing with that, since they already have the research.
Oh, absolutely, yes, that's a great suggestion.
And Captain Harper was actually a great model, because what I'd like to hear from folks is stuff that we want to hear more about based on what someone has reported, like additional questions.
Yeah, I have contacts with all of these people now. We really have a good flow of information, and so if there's questions that people have, please now or later, just throw them out.
Mary Ellen.
You mentioned that restorative circles came up at this conference. Were any of those used to address similar civilian complaints?
I actually didn't mention the restorative circles because I was out of time, but very quickly I'll just mention there was an excellent panel that was given in Seattle. It was the deputy chief of the Seattle police gave the presentation along with a lawyer that sort of facilitated the restorative circle, and it involved a civilian who was shot and killed by a police officer, and there was video footage which was not necessarily conclusive. It was the first restorative circle they had, and it was a Native American member of the community that had been shot and killed, and they came together, and I don't think I can do justice in 5 minutes, but it was a very moving circle. And the thing that I would probably say that was the most compelling is the deputy chief had mentioned when he left the restorative circle, he started thinking, we didn't really achieve much, and not really sure. I mean, both parties spoke to each other, and that was really good. And so he sort of had that mindset when he was leaving, and then maybe about 3 minutes later, he started going through the whole entire conversation of everything that occurred, and he realized that there were more agreements that had been agreed upon in that meeting than probably in any other meeting that the police department had ever had with the public before, and that they had a whole number of issues in which the public and the police department was going to start working together. And it was the first time that they had ever had something like this, but the community was absolutely on fire over this shooting, and many officers also felt that.
The one that happened last year around the
Yeah, and many of the officers also felt very upset that one of their officers had been involved in the shooting, and they wanted to reach out to the community. And so what this restorative circle had done is really calmed everybody down and really allowed for an open amount of communication.
Yes. Would you please find out some more about the supplementary training for police complaints for people who are on
I can actually send out an agenda that the executive director of this mediation group sent us, which involves what they did for that type of training. Is there anything specific that you would want other than that?
That would be a good
Okay.
start, and I think I may have that same contact, but it would be helpful.
Lloyd?
Yeah, Laura.
I'm curious as to why officers keep their uniforms on and their guns in both of the models.
Are there any other parts of Simone or Heather and Alice's presentation that y'all like more information about? Lou, I'm a little curious about like I'm sorry.
You probably answered that, and I'm not totally zone out. The training model for their media use, what models did they use?
As far as what types of mediation models are they
Yeah.
using? I can get back to you on that, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if language barrier issues came up.
Actually, they never did, but I can certainly talk about that with, I think actually, I take that back. I think that San Francisco said that they use a certified interpreter in their process, but I will check up on that.
Because that's a concern here, especially since there are no standards
Right?
for interpreters here.
Okay.
I think we might have 4 in the whole state.
Right. Okay.
And Lou, I wanted to hear more about y'all's agreements with these different court systems and how the funding structure works.
It depends. Some of the funding is fee, we get the fees, but they receive the funding from the state or from federal or whatever, and we contract to them. And in some cases, I work with the individuals or the organizations or institutions, and we write our own funding, our own grant for that. So some of it is government, some of it is private foundations.
Do you know what streams they're getting funded through the state for it?
Where they're getting it from?
For which?
Say, PIS, where is that coming from?
Well, PBIS is DOE, Department of Education.
Okay, that makes sense. But like juvenile court, for instance, who's funding?
I don't know. I don't know who's funding that.
You probably can just call juvenile court and it's easy to track down, but they do have funding for alternative tracks to get kids. It's just there, so it wouldn't be difficult to find out.
And the
Heather, could you
Jefferson,
hold that as a research point for me that I want to find out how these things are paid for?
and the Jefferson Parish work through FINS, and FINS is funding it. Family Services. Sorry.
Like there's an organization called Families
No,
in Need?
FINS
It's a categorization,
FINS are agencies that work actually under the State Supreme Court, and they work under the court systems of
Social workers.
Okay, yeah.
Well, the government will
Yeah, I just.
So again, it's government
It
money.
could be designated as things, but I don't actually know.
What's the family? I
Is
mean,
that the
it's
Department
the
of
kid
Social
and they cause it?
No.
Yeah.
It's the Supreme Court that's paying for all of this.
But sometimes.
The social services, social workers, rather than one that.
Well, I'm gonna find whatever legislation or what have agreements govern that stuff, because I'm really curious if there's any money there for this.
The Louisiana Children's Trust Fund is another major funder for a lot of these activities for us.
Children's Trust Fund. All right.
I just want to mention something quickly. I'm passing around the DC, some of the stats from DC, some of the forms from the DC Police Mediation Program, and also San Francisco. San Francisco went this way, DC went this way. And right now, Michael has the PowerPoint from the Community Mediation Maryland program, which is the program, Al, that you had mentioned, that specifically trains mediators in how to mediate police complaints. Yeah, sorry.
schedule right now, which is, you know, how it goes for us, but we're having a good discussion, so I'm happy. I kind of need a break. Does anyone else need a break? Okay. So why don't we give ourselves like, it's 3:24, let's give ourselves 6 minutes to come back at 3:30.
Can you, before we go, can you just mention what you hope for us to achieve after we?
Yes, and when we come back from the break, at the very least, I'd like to have a discussion about goals. So if y'all remember, Astrid Bergen, our expert, drafted a blueprint for us that laid out some best practices and some questions for us to answer. Based on her research, she gave us these sample goals. So when we come back, we're going to talk about if we want to adopt this in whole or in part, add to it, subtract, whatever, so that we can define the overarching goals of the New Orleans Community Police Remediation Program. And hopefully we will be able to do that within the next hour, or at least identify one or two that we have consensus on. And if by some miracle we breeze through this, we'll get into benchmarks and deliverables. But all of this stuff inside your blueprint, and Lou, I'm not sure that y'all ever got copies of the blueprint. I will make sure you get copies. But for everyone else, you should reference pages 12 through 14. Okay, it is now 3:26, so why don't we come back at 3:32 for our mediation program. And as y'all might remember on page, I believe it's page 13 of your blueprint, Astrid provided some sample goals based on other programs. So if everyone agrees, I thought we could do a version of the finger voting, which is everyone comes up here and reads it, and I have 3 different flags. If you love it and you want to keep it, give it a blue flag. If you could live with it but have some reservations, want to discuss, give it a yellow flag. And if it's absolutely not, I veto, can you give it a red? And if we could just take a couple of minutes for everyone, I'll read them.
May
All.
I ask
Yes,
a
ma'am.
question? This is not to exclude additional goals.
No, after we deal with this, we're going to talk about additional goals. So I'm going to read real quick, and then we're just going to take a moment to come up here and flag the ones how we feel about it. So the first one is a goal of mediation is understanding. Problems stemming from community police interactions are often based on miscommunication. So the goal is to build understanding between parties. 2, problem solving. Determine what factors led to the complaint. Was it a misunderstanding, a failure to communicate, and/or inappropriate behavior? And 3, reconciling. Reaching some agreement that the parties have listened and gained a better understanding through listening and dialogue, and may include an apology. So these are the sample goals that Astrid provided based on other mediation programs. I'm going to model just my personal opinion. I love problem solving.
If you assume that she's doing this in order to sway your opinion, you're correct.
No. I think understanding is good, but we need to get a little more specific. I think this reconciling thing is valuable, but it needs a lot of work. So with that, we'll take a couple of minutes for everyone to come and flag how they feel.
I'm biased.
We're not, I mean, as far as language, we're voting on language as well
We're
as
voting on
concepts.
content right now, we can wordsmith
Concept.
later. Red flags, and we have a consensus on veto, but just 1 or 2 means that we need to have some sort of subcommittee or further discussion red flags.
We can use as many as we want of
Yes.
one color, right?
Yes. I'm sorry. Now I see somebody made an orange. With an orange man. Somebody put red and yellow together.
Someone like color.
Yeah, I saw that one. Very creative.
It's a variation of yellow.
Not quite an variation of red.
They created a level of degree.
Indeed, all these smart people making things complicated.
Did you just do that based on the other responses?
There was a typo, I think yellow development that's appropriate than
All right, so it looks like 2 has the most consensus, but we need to do work on the wording. So let's talk about, okay, we can do 2 things. We could talk about goals that we want to add to it, or we can start talking about our problems with 1 and 3. Which one do y'all want to do first? Want to talk about problems with 1 and 3, or talk about goals that we'd like to add to this?
I would say, let's end with this.
Okay.
And, because we don't know where the other goals may take us, or the thought process for that.
So let's just go popcorn. What are people's reservations with understanding? I'll go and start. My number 1 reservation with this is just vagueness, right? Like, yes, there probably are miscommunications and misunderstandings, but when you say mutual understanding, are we saying that we all agree on certain facts? Or all agree on a certain perspective on those facts? For instance, like, everyone could agree that Central City is a high crime area, but do we agree that the best way to address that is by like a lot of stop and frisk, right? This is vague, I'm not thinking this through well, but I don't know what we mean by this. I want to change the wording of it, but what are other folks' reservations about this?
I had 2. One was, so the goal, maybe a goal might be one thing, and the other issue, mutual understanding, might be a better understanding instead of a mutual issue, I'm not sure.
I agree with that. Better understand.
I was thinking, I wonder if listening would be a better word, or, because sometimes understanding is understanding where somebody else is coming from is sometimes not possible, and it's sometimes kind of almost insulting to think that somebody would try to understand where you're coming from when they are coming from such a different place. Listening can sometimes feel like more achievable.
Understanding seems like it makes I think that result trumps someone's evolution. Like, it's fine whether you understand or evolve to come to you appreciate my perspective, but it's more important to me that a result be achieved so that we can avoid this problem again. And so this the understanding seems like it just sort of is attached to someone else's evolution, and I don't know that's necessarily a process that we want to be.
So this is just like too soft and unmeasurable.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for, especially in this kind of endeavor, when you're talking about a governmental agency and a community, there's a formal relationship.
Right.
And understanding just sort of makes this, it's more of a relation, like, I don't know, it feels just more of a personal relation.
Let's get Luke and Al and Annie.
The focus on miscommunication, I really don't see that as being the primary. I think sometimes people communicate very well. It's just that what they're communicating about is where the conflict is. And when you're looking at problem solving, then you're looking at what's underneath where that communication is. So that's why I went for that second one rather than the first one, because I think the second one kind of takes into account the possibility of miscommunication, and that miscommunication really isn't an issue, the factor.
So miscommunication is not the core issue, miscommunication is encapsulated in the problem.
It would be captured in the problem solving and not be, not be considered the focus of everything that is done in mediation.
Eva, were you here when we voted?
Yeah.
Did you get to put flags up here?
Oh, no.
Might be the winning vote,
Yeah, so what we're doing, we're putting blue flag around it, like, we agree with it as a goal, we want to move forward with the yellow, if there's some questions about it, in red, we just don't like it. And so, we're talking about the ones we have yellow around right now, and blue just named his problems with the word miscommunication, and next was Al and Captain Harper.
Yeah, I mean, like to me, this miscommunications almost seem like soften the extent of the conflict too much in my mind, and where it seems like maybe a little add-on, maybe, miscommunications, common misunderstanding, and a little bit of language and problem solving or inappropriate behavior or something to that, because it's really what leads to the part of the interaction which leads to conflict. And so in my mind, reading something like that, miscommunication. Now, I don't know if this is just for internal goals, or is there some point, someone seeking mediation is going to read that in a pamphlet in terms of understanding the 3 goals of our mediation process. And so to me, like, if I feel that I'm pulled over because I'm a black male driving down whatever street, in my mind, there's no miscommunication like that. That's inappropriateness or misunderstanding. So it seems to be like something, whether or not that was the issue, but that's how it's being interpreted from.
So if I'm hearing you right, miscommunication can, first of all, insult folks, and second of all, obscure the underlying issues.
It's more than just miscommunication.
Okay. It's greater.
More, how we was kind of, much more than just miscommunication.
Are we saying that we
Misunderstanding.
don't believe that
And
any
that,
complaint could ever just be about miscommunication?
well, it's part of it, but it's not the sole thing. I mean, and I know, it's not the sole. But I'm saying, like, based on my example, a misunderstanding, I'm referencing to what Simone said earlier, how one of the resolutions of mediation, and then the agreement asked the police officer to teach at the school attend the church function to show that they were somewhat viable in the community. So right there, that person I'm giving the sense felt there was not only miscommunication, but a strong misunderstanding of my role as a person who I am. So I want to show that officer, clear up that misunderstanding that I'm a viable part in this communication, in this community. So I would add additional miscommunication, misunderstanding, or inappropriate, or maybe inappropriate is a little strong. We can choose another word, but kind of understand why I'm kind of reaching.
I see where you're going.
Thought it was somebody else after. Yes.
It was blue and Al.
Oh, okay. Just in a general sense, not on that specific. That, as it is very difficult, or would be very difficult to measure on somebody. I'm not sure what we're doing with these goals, and I think that's why she kind of was addressing the result issue. That statement doesn't really lend itself very easily to you trying to measure if understanding occurred on any level. So I'm not sure if the goals, if what we're going to have, if they're going to be measurable by some standard or measure or whatever, then whatever we put up there has to have some way that we can kind of look at it and come up with a way that we're going to measure whether that actually occurred on some level.
Can you explain the difference to the group between goals and objectives?
An objective is a specific number, a time frame, or whatever the case is. But out of the objective, for instance, looking at that, if we say, okay, we're going to measure understanding, or we want to reduce or increase understanding by whatever, or how do we know understanding actually occurred? In that case, I just think it's just difficult with that terminology to determine that, unless we're going to have some kind of scale before we start and say, what do you understand? Here are the issues and what is your understanding? Okay, how would you rate it? I rate it as 1. And then when it's over with, how do you rate your understanding now? I rate it now as a 4. If you have